We've all heard of the American Revolution and probably the French and Indian War. But what about the massive, brutal war that came before them? I'm talking about Queen Anne's War, a truly continent-spanning conflict that's often overlooked, but it absolutely laid the groundwork for the America we know today.
So, where does it all begin? Well, like so many of these massive global conflicts, it starts in a royal bedroom in Europe. A king dies, there's no heir, and suddenly everyone's fighting over who gets the crown. But the real question is, how on earth did this distant European power struggle just explode into a full-blown war that stretched all the way from the icy shores of Newfoundland down to the swamps of Spanish Florida? We're talking about a war that saw fortresses besieged, entire towns burned to the ground, and indigenous populations almost completely wiped out. So let's get into it.
Here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at how this world war even started. Then we'll head south to the really brutal fighting in Carolina and Florida. After that, we'll jump up to the New England frontier to see what these terrifying raids were all about. Then we'll cover the huge campaigns to conquer Canada. And finally, we'll see how the war's end literally redrew the map of America and why that just set the stage for an even bigger war down the road.
Okay, first things first. What we call Queen Anne's War was really just one piece of a much, much bigger global puzzle. The main event was actually happening over in Europe, and it was called the War of the Spanish Succession.
So here's the spark. In 1700, the King of Spain dies without a child. In his will, he names Philip, who just happens to be the grandson of the super-powerful King Louis XIV of France, as his heir. Now, for England and its allies, this was an absolute nightmare scenario. A unified French and Spanish empire, a Catholic superpower controlling huge chunks of Europe and the Americas? No way. So they form what they called the Grand Alliance to stop it. And by 1702, the world is at war. And even though they might have hoped to keep their colonies out of it, the fight had already jumped the Atlantic.
And this is where things get really complex over here in North America. See, this wasn't just English colonists fighting French and Spanish colonists. No, this was a massive, tangled web of alliances. The French and Spanish had powerful indigenous allies, like the Wabanaki Confederacy up in the northeast and the Choctaw in the south. The British, meanwhile, allied with groups like the Muskogee, who you might know as the Creek, and the Chickasaw. And you see that little note about the Iroquois Confederacy? They played this incredibly smart but dangerous game of neutrality for most of the war. And that decision alone shaped the entire northern front of this conflict.
So the first place where things really kicked off in a big way was down south. This was the sprawling, contested borderland between the English province of Carolina and Spanish Florida. And let me tell you, this was not a war of pitched battles and honorable surrenders. This was a brutal, no-holds-barred war of raids and total destruction. So you had the English in Carolina, who, along with their Muskogee and Yamasea allies, saw a golden opportunity to wipe out their Spanish rivals and expand their trade networks. On the other side, you had the Spanish in Florida, desperately trying to hold on to their colony with the help of the Appalachee and Timucua peoples. It was basically a clash of empires fought mostly by their indigenous allies.
And the fighting was just this constant back and forth. In 1702, Carolina's governor, James Moore, leads this big force to besiege St. Augustine. They burn the town down, but they just can't crack the main stone fortress. So 2 years later, Moore comes back, but this time he targets the network of Spanish missions that were the backbone of Florida. The result was a series of raids so devastating they're called the Appalachee Massacre, and they just shattered the Spanish mission system. The French and Spanish tried to get revenge with an attack on Charlestown in 1706, but it failed. So in terms of territory, the war in the South was a bloody stalemate, but the human cost, well, that was just catastrophic.
And this number, right here, this tells you everything you need to know about what happened in the South. Before the war, the indigenous population living in the Spanish missions in Florida was probably around 20,000 people. After about a decade of nonstop raids from Carolina Allied forces, that number had dropped to maybe a few hundred. We're talking about entire cultures being killed, enslaved, or scattered to the winds. For Spanish Florida and its native allies, this wasn't just a military defeat, it was pretty close to total annihilation. All right, let's head north now, to the frontier between New England and New France. Here, the war looked completely different. It was defined by a French strategy of relentless, terrifying raids that they called petite guerre. So you have to understand, New France was massively outnumbered. You're talking about maybe 15,000 people in all of French Canada versus 250,000 English colonists. There was no way they could win a conventional head-to-head war. So they adopted petite guerre, the Little War. The whole point was to use their skilled Canadian militia and their indigenous allies, especially the Wabanaki, to hit the English frontier everywhere at once, attack farms, tiny villages, crossroads, keep the much larger English population constantly off balance, terrified, and unable to organize a big invasion. And the most infamous, the most brutal example of this was the 1704 raid on Deerfield, Massachusetts. Picture this, it's the dead of winter. A force of about 300 French Canadians and their Abenaki and Mohawk allies sweeps down on this sleeping town. Within hours, 49 settlers are dead, and more than 100 are taken captive. And then they were forced on this horrific 300-mile march through the snow all the way to Canada. Many didn't make it. The ones who survived were either ransomed or, in a lot of cases, the children were actually adopted into indigenous families and never returned. It was an absolutely terrifying tactic, and it brought the war right to the front door of civilians in New England. But even this brutal kind of warfare couldn't go on forever. As the historian Michael Laramie points out, by the later years of the war, everyone was just getting exhausted. The Wabanaki had basically been fighting nonstop since the last war. Their population was being ground down, and at the same time, English privateers were getting better and better at choking off French supplies coming into Canada. That meant fewer guns, less ammo, less support for these raids. The attacks still happened, but they started to lose some of their intensity. So while the frontiers were burning, the British started to shift their focus to a much bigger prize, the complete and total conquest of New France. The fight was moving to the strategic heart of the conflict in the north. 3 spots were really key. Up in Newfoundland, the French and English just destroyed each other's fishing settlements over and over again. Then you had the Iroquois neutrality, which was so important because it basically shut down the main invasion highway from New York to Montreal. That forced the British to look elsewhere. And then that left Acadia, what we call Nova Scotia today. Its capital, Port Royal, was just a hornet's nest of French privateers who were wrecking New England's shipping. For the English colonists, taking Port Royal became an absolute obsession. So, fed up with the raids, the British and their American colonists put together 2 huge expeditions to try and deliver a knockout blow to New France. One of them would be a spectacular success. The other, an almost unbelievable disaster. Okay, check this out. In 1710, a combined force of British soldiers and colonial militia attacks Port Royal. And this time, they succeed. The fortress surrenders, Britain gets control of Acadia, and they rename it Nova Scotia. Feeling pretty good about themselves, they plan an even bigger attack for 1711, a massive naval assault on Quebec itself. We're talking a fleet of over 70 ships and 10,000 men. But the St. Lawrence River had other plans. The British admiral couldn't find anyone who knew the river. They got lost in a thick fog, and 8 ships were smashed to pieces on the rocks. Over 850 soldiers and sailors drowned. The entire invasion was called off. It was one of the worst naval disasters in British history, and it single-handedly saved New France from being conquered. Now, even with that massive failure at Quebec, the war over in Europe was going really well for the Grand Alliance. By 1713, France was beaten and ready to make peace. The treaty they signed, the Treaty of Utrecht, would completely change the balance of power in North America forever. And this right here really shows you the scale of the British victory when they got to the negotiating table. France was forced to give up huge territories, all of its claims to the Hudson Bay region, the entire island of Newfoundland, and most importantly, Acadia, or Nova Scotia, were all handed over to Great Britain. All of a sudden, France was penned in, and its control over the entrance to the St. Lawrence River was seriously weakened. So who lost? Well, France, obviously. They lost a ton of land and strategic power. But you know who the biggest losers were? France's allies. Spanish Florida was left as a hollowed-out shell. And the Wabanaki Confederacy, who had been fighting alongside the French for decades, were just completely abandoned at the peace table. Their population had been devastated by the war, and now they woke up to find they were subjects of the very empire they had been fighting against. And this really gets to the single biggest flaw in this peace treaty. As the source material points out, this whole thing was negotiated by Europeans for Europeans. The land claims, the rights, the simple existence of the indigenous people who had fought and died in this war for over a decade, they were completely ignored. So here's the bottom line. The Treaty of Utrecht didn't actually solve any of the real problems in North America. It just made them worse. It drew vague, ambiguous borders and left a deep, simmering resentment among indigenous nations who felt totally betrayed. This treaty didn't create a lasting peace. What it really did was start a 30-year countdown to the next war.
And that brings us to the final question. The Treaty of Utrecht redrew the map, no doubt about it, and it massively favored Great Britain. But by completely ignoring the deepest wounds of the war, the conflicts over land and sovereignty with indigenous peoples, did the Peace of 1713 make an even bigger, more decisive war for control of the entire continent not just possible, but completely inevitable?